Good morning, everyone. In this lunch debate, as you know, there is a LIAS gathering at stake here in Holland College, and we all have conversations on the issue of genocide. And this lunch debate is also on the theme. So we have our Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, since 2018 also known as Africa Museum, and previously the Congo Museum. It was originally built to showcase King Leopold II's Congo Free State in the International Exposition of 1897. Nothing to be proud of. In this lunch discussion, we ask the question how museum collection practices extend the temporality of genocidal atrocities. This theme will be introduced by our LIAS fellow, Zoé Samudzi. She is currently a postdoctoral scholar at the Department of African American and African Studies in the Ohio State University. She co-authored with William Anderson the books As Black as Resistant, Finding the Conditions for Liberation, published in 2018. And as a doctoral researcher at University of California, San Francisco, she studied German colonialism, the Herero and Namaqua genocide, and the role of science in the indigenous and black identity. The respondent for the lunch debate is another distinguished LIAS fellow, Dirk Moses. He's a little bit there in the back. He is the Anna and Bernard Spitzer Professor of the International Relations at the City College of New York. Dirk has written extensively in the fields of genocide and memory studies, as well as intellectual history. And his latest book is The Problems of Genocide, Permanence, Security, and the Language of Transgression, appeared in February 2012. But now I give the floor to Zoé Samudzi.
I want to begin with a concept that has emerged from social psychology, and it's called terror management theory. And terror management theory describes not only the anxiety that is produced by the inevitability of one's own individual death, but also the shared cultural mythologies and practices that are deployed to offer a sense of death transcendence or immortality. This can be a little bit more literal, as with the creation of religious afterlives, or it can be a symbolic extension of the immortal cultural self. So the legacy of the nuclear family, canonical artworks, donations made in your and your family name, and so on. But regardless, these cultural modes of transcending death allow us to feel that we are significant contributors to a permanent world. Sheldon Solomon, Jeff Greenberg, and Tom Paczynski write in their text, The Worm at the Core, which explicates and codifies this concept. Central to the theory, to terror management theory, is this idea of self-esteem and its relationship to mortality salience, so this understanding of our own inevitable death. And this in turn drives our belief in our own significance and resilience and permits us to forget the inescapability of our demise or to altogether believe that we can transcend death. Motivated by the need to affirm the correctness of our worldviews, human beings constantly search for individuated meaning, just as the Institutional Archive of the West and its ethnographic museum, such as the Royal Museum for Central Africa, founded by King Leopold II in 1898, seeks to unequivocally assert the truths of empire. Within this archive, imperial truths are affirmed to the public as fact through historical interpretation and narration and the display of the cultural and biological material of colonized people. Scholar Ariella Azulay notes how the contemporary sense of the word art emerged only in the 18th century and was linked to a desire for mastery over time. Art exists as part of an imperial dislocation that forces indigenous communities into a forward-moving linear order. The accumulation of art and artifacts by museums and archives, which is a part of the same process of plunder and dispossession, is a way to, as she says, avoid engaging with the world shared with others. The museum and its archive represent tensions among white supremacy's founding fictions, for example, scientific racism, fears and warnings of Western civilizational decline, the inevitability of the end of every empire, and the contestations of white power by movements for the liberation of, and the expansion of rights and self-determining capabilities for marginalized people. This assertion of power knowledge and the accompanying epistemicide within the museum is profoundly alienating, and it remains so despite desires for museums to be kind of safe or brave or dialogical or democratic spaces. And in the Q&A, I can talk a little bit about how I, in under 10 minutes, started crying the first time that I went to the Humboldt Forum in Berlin. This alienation is a product of the twinned actions of attempting to destroy a people as they exist in the world and then recreate them solely in the image of their colonial masters. We call this social death. And here, the word epistemicide also defines the maintenance work performed on the literal human remains in order to test and prove eugenicist hypotheses about racial difference. In her essay, Remain Conquered, scholar Yoon Sung Kim describes how archival storage facilities are cold, literally very, very cold by design. The artifacts held hostage within those archives are fixed into the condition of object immortalization, she says. And she characterizes the museum as a mausoleum that traps objects in time, a notable continuation of this global production of racialized space. And here she considers the co-evolution and the relationship between the museum and the penitentiary, which Tony Bennett has gone on to talk about with his notion of the exhibitionary complex. The objects are preserved in carefully climate-controlled conditions from the environment, the natural environment, from too much heat or too little heat, from the very notion of unruly temperatures, she writes. And it is this fastidious conservation effort, ironically, that excludes the objects from having any kind of context and history beyond that which is afforded by the institution, another kind of what we would call natal alienation. Such an atmosphere finds a natural complement in Black Studies scholar Christina Sharp's understanding of anti-Black weather. She juxtaposes the artificial ecology of the archive with the global climate of degradation that transforms Black being, extracting Black personhood from its own varied life worlds and social worlds, and supplanting that existence into the frame of a triumphant white domination. In service of empire, this macabre archive communicates two things. First, the fear of mortality vis-a-vis civilizational decline is inextricably linked to the desire to exercise godlike dominion over the natural world, of which indigenous populations are obviously considered a part. And we see this quite literally in museum structures, where we see indigenous culture alongside these displays of plant and animal life. The common thread between anxious and dutiful civilizational maintenance and the refusal to repatriate human remains and objects within these archives is the Western obsession with permanence, to link the psychological to the ontological, to the condition of being and existing, which clashes with other cultural understandings that some things, most things actually, are not meant to exist forever. Our bodies are not supposed to exist forever. Our cultural objects are also not supposed to exist forever. And so the anxiety about repatriation is this idea that when certain things are returned to indigenous communities, people will either destroy them, bury them, or allow them to naturally degrade over time as they are supposed to. This refusal to repatriate, then, is a production of this idea of eternality, which is also a disruption of death. And the permanent maintenance of human remains in museums prevents proper transition, ancestral transition, because of the absence of funerary rites or the disruption of this process of ancestralization, because a lot of the human remains that are in these museums were obtained by digging up graves. And this is a further posthumous insult to the many peoples who have died of unnatural causes through concentration camp labor and exposure, colonially introduced illness, and poverty by way of the elimination of cattle, land, agricultural capability, and other lifeblood resources. So here, of course, we more explicitly arrive at the question of genocide and my entrance into studying genocide, which has been through Germany's attempted extermination of Ovaherero and Nama peoples in its colony in Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, at the beginning of the 20th century. History says between 1904 and 1908. Here, it becomes necessary to make a crucial distinction between genocide as a crime captured through international law and genocide as an uncapturable metaphysical transformation. As a crime, genocide is something that is ideally prosecutable, a bounded phenomenon with a beginning and end and a set of perpetrators that can be taken to a tribunal. And while Raphael Lemkin attended to colonial violence in the Americas as foundational to his genocide concept, the law as it exists fails to attend to colonialism as a process, to colonialism as a structure, to the structures of genocide, indeed, that remained in place after the genocide supposedly ended. And of course, after historian Patrick Wolf, the consequence of genocide's native policy in its former colony in Namibia, the defining characteristic of settler coloniality was, quote, the processual dissolution of native society and the erection of a new colonial society on the expropriated land base. This notion of genocide time emerges because of how genocide operates across all three temporal registers of time, which are all of the registers of time that we can recognize within this kind of cosmological plane. Genocide entails the historical rewriting of a people's past, and here I understand history as something very distinct from the past, through an annihilatory violence in the present that forecloses the possibility of a people's future. The museum as a technology within the architecture of genocide duly operates in these trans-temporal registers. African people and their pasts are enclosed within grossly insufficient and racist historical narrations in order to justify mistreatment, exclusion, marginalization, neo-colonial policy in the present as a foreclosure of possibilities of fully self-determining futures both in the diaspora and on the African continent. Time as a variable in the calculus of reparations and restitution pertains to the time scale created by indigenous historiographies and memory, as well as the disparity between indigenous time, a kind of global plurality of indigenous time, obviously, don't want to make it kind of homogeneous, and a genocidal colonial time, which is homogeneous, between indigenous phenomenologies, ways of being in and knowing the world, and the German preclusion of Ovaherero and Nama people from modernity. Western time can only ever be progressively linear and forward-moving, and it of course seems that Germany is incapable of embracing a memory frame that accounts for and moves between past wrongdoings, present materialities, and future world makings for all of its kind of victims of genocide. It is rendered incapable because it simply refuses a state politic of memory beyond a reiterated guilty reparation for singular harm, which Melanie Klein would describe as a kind of manic reparation, rather than a commitment to address and repairing the structure of colonial violence within which that harm was and is situated and indeed globalized. So here, there are two ways, or at least I approach this idea of the afterlife of the Ovaherero genocide, this process and structure of the genocide in kind of two key ways. The first is an attendance to the materialities of the people themselves. The still unresolved land question in southern Africa, which it's also a kind of a question, it's in Namibia, in Zambia to some extent, Zimbabwe, and South Africa, pertains to the theft of land by Germans, the maintenance of unequal racial geographies during apartheid, and the present ongoing dispossession of land by the contemporary Namibian state and the kind of slippages between a position of native during the colonial period and then what happens when the native dispossesses other natives and how this creates different kinds of relationships to power. the land question is intimately related to the question of repatriation and restitution, as it places these still incarcerated remains of ancestors at our fore. Ancestralization speaks to the performance of traditional funerary practice, the transition of indigenous dead from this life to the next, or the completion of a life cycle, depending, and the failure for the lives taken to receive any semblance of proper and, in the words of community, dignified burial, which in turn has implications for the living, right? Like if we don't properly bury our ancestors, we are haunted. Our families are haunted by our ancestors. This is not simply a kind of anthropological phenomenon or alternative way of knowing. I don't really respect this idea of cultural relativism because it's pretty patronizing. But this is the metaphysical regime within which people are living and existing that must be taken seriously and evaluated against these contesting colonial Christian understandings of death, and that inform material, cultural, and juridical arguments for against the German state. So there is a process of translating this metaphysical experience into the ways that communities are actually making legal demands for restitution, legal demands for land. From collecting specimens by grave robbing to forcing indigenous women to scrape clean skulls of their dead in concentration camps, the bones that the community are calling for were quite literally used as evidence of European superiority and harvested to supply demand for eugenic research and display. Because around the time that colonialism begins, it is illegal to grave rob in Europe, and so the colonies become a site of collection for the anatomical specimens that they need for their research here in Europe. As many of us from and on the continent, and I can very confidently say that this is also the case for many, many indigenous people around the world, you cannot die if you are not buried properly. Right? It's not possible, right? We see the kind of horror in Gaza where people have no bodies to bury and they are assessing a complete human person by mass, right? There is something that is deeply cosmologically, spiritually wrong with this beyond the clear kind of legal transgression. You cannot be fully laid to rest if you are trapped in a box in a museum basement. You cannot die if your ancestral land is owned by a descendant of German settlers who do not give you permission to access your land, to access the land where you are supposed to die, right? And as Nama leaders told me back in 2019 when I was having trouble with the American Museum of Natural History that has a very large collection of Ova Herero and Nama skulls, I'll kind of quote this at length. For the Nama leaders, landlessness and political, economic, and social marginalization is directly linked to genocide. Calls for the return of ancestral land and the initial response of the Namibian government amounted to trashing these calls with utterances like, "You don't eat land," and "What ancestral land are you talking about?" and "How do you want to hold present generations accountable for something they did not do?" That's something Europeans love to say, right? These are sentiments of the same regime claiming to negotiate in the interest of victimized communities. There's a deliberate refusal on the part of both governments to admit that the landlessness of the Nama people is a structural issue never addressed by any regime. We shall remain resolute to regain our ancestral land, notwithstanding state tricks to render our people perpetually landless and poverty-stricken for good. German genocide facilitated the structural loss of ancestral land, and therefore the two issues will not be separated. And so, of course, they're describing also the institutional and governmental collusions between the Namibian and German state governments in their broad and illegal, right, under international humanitarian law around indigenous rights, exclusion of these communities from discussions about genocide recognition, reparations, and restitution. And then finally, the second historical frame of the afterlife of the Ova Herero and Nama genocide is to think about the trans-geographical structures of genocidal dispossession with Germany at the center. So first, if we refuse to distinguish Nazi fascism from European and German colonialism, right? Like if we take seriously Arendt and Césaire and all of these contentions that German fascism is an expression of imperialist expansion and settler colonial desire. And second, if we take seriously a colonial relationship between Germany describing Israeli security as its contemporary Staatsräson, Israeli security, not Jewish safety, right? So understanding the reason for the state not as an obligation to European and particularly German Jews, but to the existence of Israel, as a kind of captured understanding of the futurity of global Jewry. If we understand the relationship between the Staatsräson and the uniqueness of the Holocaust that refuses to place the Holocaust into historical dialogue with German imperialism or any other forms of European imperialism, then third, it becomes necessary to triangulate Germany's memory culture around the Holocaust through, first, its denialism of the Herero and Nama genocide, and secondly, its material and ideological support for the ongoing genocide of Palestinians against Palestinians in Gaza as a continuation of the logics of the Nakba. And it's really interesting to hear how Ova Herero and Nama people triangulate themselves as historical actors on their own behalves. So bearing time in mind, I will just stop there. Thank you so much.
Yesterday evening, Jelle asked me to be the commentator. So I'm hearing Zoe's dazzling presentation for the first time, though I'm familiar with Zoe's work from past interactions in the US and in Germany. So I hope I can offer some useful thoughts for our discussion, and I hope I can also pose some questions to Zoe for the elaboration, because we have discussion time afterwards, don't we? So Zoe has thrown a lot at you, and your heads may be spinning. I'm sure they are. So I'm going to try to distill some of the insights so that we can have an informed discussion. Zoe mentioned the concept of metaphysical regime. By that, I understand her as suggesting that there are distinctions between a European modernist metaphysical regime, which entails a philosophy of history based on notions of linear progress, moving in this mode of thinking from the barbarous to the civilized, from Naturvölker, as the Germans put it, to Kulturvölker. I bet you there's a Dutch version of that concept. Is there? You won't understand what I'm saying. I'm a German speaker, not a Dutch speaker. Yeah, which was a staple of German and I would say general European anthropology around 1900, which is when the genocide took place in Southwest Africa, around that time. If you read German anthropologists, and maybe Dutch ones and Belgian ones, they would categorize the peoples of Australia, the indigenous peoples where I come from, and Africa as Naturvölker, and the Europeans were, of course, Kulturvölker. The British didn't use the word of culture, but civilized, which leads us back to Rome and the notion of civilization, and Hannah Arendt. Did you mention her briefly in relation to Césaire? So we all know who Hannah Arendt was. And she's often taken to be in agreement with Aimé Césaire, the famous Martinican poet, literary figure, politician, theorist, in proposing that the Nazi regime was an imperial project in Europe in the same way that Europeans had colonized, exploited and murdered Africans, say. So we're sort of bouncing back into Europe of their colonialism, known as the boomerang thesis, which of course is an Australian weapon. And however, unlike Aimé Césaire, who critiqued the Western metaphysical regime in his famous essay, Discourse on Colonialism, so 1951 or something, and lamented the African futures and Arab futures would be smashed in colonialism, and the possibility of African modernity on its own terms, rather than being stuck in time, in culture, but could have developed in its own ways. Unlike Césaire, Arendt was a very Eurocentric thinker and a neo-Roman thinker. She celebrated Rome as a progenitor of civilization, and this goes back to the question of eternity, which Zoé started with. In her many texts, you have to read the footnotes. She has a footnote in The Origins of Totalitarianism where she talks about the Belgian Congo. And she mentions the 10 million or so people who died. But it's just a footnote in her book. It's not really part of the general analysis. She acknowledges that Europeans were responsible in one way or the other for the mass death of Africans and others in Australia too, in their exploits. But for her, it's just a footnote because the main lesson for her is that the Western powers, the French and the British, who had colonial empires, had defeated the Nazi Empire, which was for her a tribal enterprise by the Germans. It came out of the pan-German movement, who thought in terms of Germany as a Naturvolk. She interpreted, and she was typical of type of mid-century intellectual, interpreted the Germans as a rebellion, the Nazis, as a rebellion against civilized Europe. It was neo-paganism. So what we needed after the war, as an answer to the Nazis, was the European metaphysical regime. Because she understood the Nazis in a way as the indigenous, but indigenous German, tribal metaphysical regime. And what she was contemptuous of, and she's quite contemptuous of, say, the African mode of being, like Hegel, was that they didn't produce anything permanent. Mm-hmm. So when Zoé says the bodies of the dead go back to nature and decompose, along with artifacts, and that's inherent to, if you like, an indigenous metaphysical regime, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different metaphysical regime. Arendt saw this supposed inability of tribal peoples, African peoples, to build permanent structures like the Acropolis and the Forum in Rome, the Holland House, right, as a cultural failing. They were primitive. They didn't build anything permanent. And the spirit, Hegel's spirit, objective spirit, is about building permanent civilizations. Of course, that was ruptured by the fall of Rome. And then we have, what do we call that in that period of European history? We used to, the Dark Ages. Probably when you were at high school, it was the Dark Ages. And then you had the Renaissance, and the Enlightenment. The light comes back into the darkness. This is the European metaphysical frame that Zoe is talking about. That for us, and I grew up like this, was the answer to the Nazis. And I say that because we're having a workshop on genocide. Okay. However, I think what Zoe is teaching us is that metaphysical frame of progress, permanence, and civilization is contingent upon the genocidal extinction of peoples in Australia, in Africa, and in many other parts of the world. And that is something that these museums, which we were talking about last night in a panel, and you have down the road in the Africa Museum, which I visited a few years ago, that they're wrestling with. Because, from an indigenous perspective or a Congolese perspective, going in there and seeing the artifacts is a different experience than for Europeans. It's like why aren't these back home? Why are there skeletons sitting there? And just as a footnote to that, and I'll end with this, I visited the Museum of Natural History, no, it's actually the History of World Cultures in Vienna. Has anyone been to that? Azar's been to that. It's very impressive. And I got a guided tour by with a group, with one of the curators. So we got into the stores downstairs, which are massive. It's like a catacombs down there, right? And you realize that what's on display is a tiny fraction of what they have. So there's one sort of African statue, I forget where it's from, it's about that big, and it's from, say, Nigeria, part of Nigeria, right? Downstairs, they're like 50. They're just sitting on a shelf, as Zoe says, in temperature-controlled conditions, because it's wood, so it doesn't deteriorate. There's this like excess, and it's kind of disgusting. Like, why do you need 50 of these? And now they say it's for research. You know, each one has a little label on it. And you know, so when it was acquired and so forth. A lot of it's not plundered, it's purchased on some kind of market. Of course, we could question that market, but it's different. You know, 1850 is different to 1950 to, you know, 2020. The markets were different. In any event, they have quite a few Benin bronzes, and in Vienna, and they weren't part of the British expedition that looted these, right? But they were then on the European art market around 1900, and through various, you know, chains of purchase, they ended up in Vienna hands, and they have the documentation. They showed us, that's all handwriting, about how it came to be in their hands. And because it's rather removed, unlike it is in the British museums, where it's quite direct, they plead a kind of innocence. But there is an ongoing investigation there about how they ended up in their hands, and the provenance research is obviously difficult if you don't have all the documents. In any event, what I observed, and I'll finish with this, is that the curators who work with the artifacts are often very conscious of the issues that Zoe raised, because they've come out of critical museum studies programs, which quite a few universities have. But the people running the museums, who are often retired diplomats or you know, creatures of the state and aren't experts really in museums, and are responsible to a board, a committee, which are representative bureaucracies and so forth, and are governed by law, by legislation. They ensure that the progressive energies and impulses of the curators, which who work, you know, have established relationships with people from where the stuff comes from, and want to return them or come to some kind of sharing arrangement, they're resisted, and then leads to a whole political process of negotiation and resistance, and sometimes can only be cut through by a sort of post-colonial, neo-colonial relationship where, for example, France, under Macron, declares colonialism, this is a few years ago, as a crime against humanity, and wants to start restituting and returning objects. That is part of a soft diplomacy relationship that's being established with certain African countries, because what? Do you think they're giving them back because they feel bad? It's because the government there has its own museum and wants those objects, and the French want the minerals, which are being dug up out of the ground, or they want to establish a military base, or both. Or there's, you know, a French mining company, or a Dutch, maybe a Belgian oil company. So the art world, the restitution world, the museum world are all connected when it comes to high politics. And this is where these, you know, contemporary African states, as Zoe gestured to in Namibia, are in cahoots with European ones. But these African states have many peoples within them, usually, and there are winners and losers in the process of colonialism. And in the Namibian case, the Herero Nama people struggling against their own government as well as against the Germans, And there are then clashing metaphysical regimes there, but they're articulated in high politics, and it's often very cynical. I'll finish with that. Okay.
So now you have the opportunity to ask questions. One comes with the micro to you for the record.
Glad I explained it perfectly.
Yeah, there. And there, look.
Thank you very much for this. I have to say, I would very much happily like to hear more. I have one question and maybe one opening. So I would be curious, you made a point that I think is really essential, this distinction between genocide, which now we've reduced to this legal concept, to a much more, in my opinion, meaningful notion of genocide as a metaphysical or ontological rupture or breach. And I imagine that that's also something that has been reflected on much more deeply within Black studies. So I'm kind of curious if you can maybe develop that a little bit more, because that field doesn't have the same space here as it does perhaps in the US. I also want to offer the opening. You mentioned that within 10 minutes you were in tears. If you want to share, I would be curious what that was about. And then maybe I felt a bit triggered as somebody who once was a committed Arendtian. So I think what's important is, in addition to that footnote, she does make clear on page 290 of Origins that Europeans, in having committed the Holocaust, are also complicit and responsible for the Nakba and everything that happens to Palestinians. So I do think that's one of the things I want to salvage from Arendt, because it's something we really need to repeat every day, perhaps, as a mantra. I also think the irony of Arendt's and most Europeans' ignorance when it comes to the genocide in Namibia, because I'm thinking of the Great Zimbabwe, which makes the Acropolis look like a kindergarten. And if it's true, so if Europeans had had any ability, or now, to stop limiting knowledge to Eurocentric knowledge, they would see that their claims make absolutely no sense, which is unfortunate.
Shall I just go ahead and answer since there's, yeah. I remember, I forget how old he was, but a kind of elder of mine was telling me that he learned in school that Great Zimbabwe was built by an extraterrestrial something, which is kind of nuts. So my experience in the Humboldt Forum, I'll first start with Black Studies and genocide. So what Black Studies does is it really refuses to take for granted what it means to be human. We talk a lot about human rights and a kind of inalienable right as a person and whatever, but it refuses to allow for this subjectivity to go uninterrogated. And indeed, one of the kind of centerpieces of Black Studies insists that the very notion of a human is supplanted onto this idea of a self-possessed, self-contained European man. Capital M man, not necessarily gendered, but also necessarily gendered, but kind of fixed into whiteness, an idea and notion of individuated and individually recognized citizenship that a huge majority of the world has never been subjected to. And more importantly, I think, the fact that anti-Blackness is foundational to our very understanding and notion of modernity. I wrote a paper, I think in 2021, which I was fresh out of grad school, so quality is questionable. But I was kind of arguing that it is, to some extent, impossible to recognize a genocide of Black people, because there is no universe, there is no space in modernity in which Black people are not supposed to die. in which black people are not rendered as people who are killable, enslavable, vulnerable to incarceration and the kind of slavery of incarceration, right? So what does it mean in this universe where the black subject has no rights as a human to then expect this subject to be legible and visible as someone who is a fully rights-bearing subject? So this is kind of why I'm invoking and thinking through meaningfully this indigenous metaphysic in the Nama and Ovaherero context, and which matches my own context as a Zimbabwean person, and the way that that context has to get funneled into the language of law and into the language of rights in order for it to make any kind of legible sense, right? It has to be, the skulls in the American Museum of Natural History, the claim is framed as unlawful commercial exchange or something like that, because the skulls were taken from Namibia by an anthropologist at the time of a genocide, but then you have to go through the nastiness of legality where Germany is like, okay, but genocide did not exist until 1948. And so we have no legal obligation to recognize any kind of atrocities that we were responsible for before 1948. The obvious irony being that Germany has no legal responsibility to recognize the Holocaust either, because the Holocaust happened before the passage of the Genocide Convention, but nevertheless, the Holocaust inhabits the center of German memory, and also that Germany, the parliament passed a resolution recognizing in terms of, and in using the word genocide, its role in Armenia. And so now we come to this beginning point of the illegibility of black subjecthood. We have this year zero of 1948 as the starting point for the capacity to recognize genocide, and yet, conveniently, Armenia and the show, which is not to say that they should not, but it is to say that there is space to make the argument that it is possible to recognize more of these things. Obviously, Germany doesn't want to recognize Namibia because it would have legal responsibilities in the form of some kind of reparations and so on. So which brings me then to my experience in the Humboldt Forum. So the Humboldt Forum comes into existence at a time when ethnographic museums are trying to steady themselves in the aftermath of these George Floyd protests, when people are refusing to allow for museums to maintain these myths of maybe neutrality or something, and are pushing for reparations and are pushing for restitution and are really pushing for some serious self-examination. And so the Humboldt Forum, if you've never been, it's a recreation of a Prussian palace, and they had to destroy the East German Palace of the Republic, and so there's that whole thing about the East and West German memory regimes, but you go in, it's this massive space, and you walk in, and it has these banners that are trying to offer some provocations about consent, ownership, cultural appropriation, which is a kind of obscene set of questions to ask in a place that has been responsible. What is cultural appropriation in the face of annihilation, right? So you go up the escalator, and you arrive in this very kind of shambolic engagement of Robin DiAngelo, who wrote a book called White Fragility, which is at one point a kind of white liberals' favorite text because it allowed them to think about their identity within whiteness without actually making a connection to colonialism, to slavery, to genocide, to all of these things. And I think I was just so overwhelmed by the kind of insult of the performance, by the idea that there is a way that you can make woke the fact that this is a building full of millions of things that were stolen, purchased, stolen, whatever, and housed in a space where your kind of life world can be reduced to a set of curios, of things to go look at and take pictures of and show your family when you go back home or to to wherever you've come to come be a tourist in Germany. And I think it was because I had come in behind a group and I was the only black person, and the group kept staring at me and kept like looking at me as I'm looking at this in kind of not a panic, but like, you know, I'm getting kind of warm and my heart rate is starting to go up. And so it's like you become a part of the backdrop, right? Like you become a part of this ambient racism in this space. You become an object just like all of the other objects. And I think that that for me was so overwhelming that I like went into a corner and I just like cried and cried and cried. And then like gathered myself and then like figured it out and like walked through the rest of it. But it's like, I tell the story sometimes, I'm like, oh my gosh, is that your first time? And I was like, no. I think at the time I went, I had been on a residency at the Wereldmuseum system in the Netherlands, and I've been writing about it and interacting with archives, so I'm not new to it. I think it's really interesting when we have these conversations about the kind of pedagogical and educational capacity of the museum, that you forget that people have, like they look at the things on the shelves and see a future that cannot exist, right? Not to kind of do a pre-colonial nostalgia and pretend that like things were peachy keen before colonialism arrived, but you see a kind of like grammar of cultural production in its volume, in its capaciousness, and you just understand that this, whatever trajectory that we could have been on, is not one that could happen anymore. And there's something that is so abject about that, and just really hard to sit with. And it's like no matter, and I think it feels important to me to keep having those emotional reactions, because I think when I start to become able to dissociate from the brutality of the space, then I think that that's when I lose my capacity to be able to do whatever I think I want to be doing in my work.
It's very interesting, thank you so much. I think about the comparison between genocide and slavery, in particular because 1 month ago it was declared, approved in the United Nations, the declaration of slavery as a major crime of humanity. Yeah? In fact, we have about 50 million people as slaves today. And the thing is, perhaps, yeah, genocide is, of course, a word that worked, and it was helpful for the crimes of Germany. But if we are only about the problem of genocide, the application of genocide by the butt of the film, let me say, the German people, yeah, we lost sometimes the picture, and the picture is, of course, as you say, the loss of human dignity approach. And the thing is, there is a genocide when you kill a person, but there is a kind of genocide when you have the person as a slave. It's another form, but in fact, and if we consider, and it was absent, but I am from Latin America, and in Latin America, the slavery was really important, and the last boats were at the end of 19th century, Matilde, Clotilde, etc., where the people really were things. And when you have problem of hunger, you put the people, yeah, into the sea, and it's done. Yeah? They were killed because they are only objects. And the thing is, if we focus only on genocide, what that means, it's naturfolken of Kulturfolken. That is not the main issue. For example, for Bartolomé de las Casas, yeah, the indigenous people were really not into this division, natural folk or cultural people or nature people. Yeah, it was in fact not a big issue, and they had privilege in comparison with Africa. Yeah, and it's outside Europe, metaphysical, the concept. And the thing is, in that case, if we use a broader scope, slavery and genocide, in which way you can defend human dignity? Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I mean, there are so many really, I think mostly useless conversations in which there are these really unhelpful comparisons between genocide and slavery. I think, for example, it's really telling that there's a kind of point at which in the kind of structuring of historicizations of the Holocaust, there's a move from calling what happened in concentration camps slavery to calling it forced labor in order to make this distinction between a kind of exceptional violence that the Nazis perpetrated versus the not so exceptional, banal, quotidian violence to which Black people were subjected in the Atlantic trade. And I think, again, this is where I am much more interested in the question of, and through Black studies, through the question of genocide as a kind of metaphysical transformation of a people, right? Like, what does it mean to pluck an indigenous people, traffic them across an ocean where we know millions and millions and millions of people died en route in the Middle Passage, and then to create a condition in which they have no past, they have no future, and they only have an existence within the context of the slave master, right? Like, this is these concepts that are described as both, again, natal alienation, the complete rupturing of oneself from their lineage, from their history, and social death, where there is, again, no existence, no possibility of any kind of future outside of this abjected condition. And even as, you know, after abolition of the trade, slavery entailed a program of breeding, which actually increases the population. I would argue that this is a genocidal form. This is a form that is destroying a people. Never mind the kind of language of human dignity or whatever, but we can also see that the crimes delineated in the Genocide Convention are present in all of these conditions of it's not just like slavery and enslaving a person, it is hereditary. Like, you are born into this condition of slavery as a result of your mother, called parta sequitur ventrum. Like, there is an impossibility of being anything other than. And this kind of, the brutality of that foreclosure, for me, is completely overwhelming, and it feels profoundly unhelpful to, one, pit it against the Nazi Holocaust, because every genocide and every process of brutality is unique in the kind of qualities and contingent structures that permit the violence, but also we don't learn more about either. We don't learn about the necessity of kind of expunging Jews from land and from history and all of the ideologies that enabled and justified the Nazi Holocaust, nor do we actually learn about what slavery was, is, and how it has structured racial life in the Americas, right? We don't learn what it means when the Catholic Church arrives in the New World and declares a people to be pagans, and the implications of what it means to be a pagan and to be outside of this legible frame of possible humanity, of the ability to have rights, to have agency, to be a self-determining person. So I could not agree more with the way that these concepts are pitted against one another, because I think that there's so much to learn and understand, one, about genocide outside of the law, but two, about what slavery, if we're talking about Atlantic slavery or different kinds of slavery, actually entails, particularly, I think, hereditary slavery. So I appreciate that.
Maybe a brief question about if you know of good examples of musea that went through the transition through the critique and came with good solutions or acceptable solutions, showing the way for a lot more museums.
Yeah, my position about museums is a little bit radical, but I will say that I do appreciate what is happening at the Wereld Museum in Amsterdam under the direction of Wayne Modest. The way that I mean, again, I was an artist resident there. We got so much access to the archives. The program that I was in, Pressing Matters, like really gave researchers because there's this way that museums talk about collaboration, and it's an incredibly kind of like fetishized, deeply asymmetrical, condescending relationship, but he really gave us a lot of free rein to come to kind of our own conclusions, obviously to consider the questions and provocations that the program laid out for us, excuse me. But really, in his own practice as a cultural worker and as a researcher, is not only critical of the space within which he works, self-implicates. And I think that is, for me, something that a lot of museum workers fail to do. They fail to recognize, and it's not about like self-flagellating and being like, I'm a bad person, I'm in charge of these archives, but really recognizing like, what does it mean for you to be a steward of violent history? And what are the ways that you can offer openings and possibilities for people to negotiate this history, to make interventions, to escape from this kind of like feedback loop of the institutional space as much as one can. He's quite supportive of restitution, which I think is incredibly important, and specifically restitution with origin communities and not with nation states, which for me is a very important distinction. I just think as far as like people that I have encountered, he is one that really has a practice that I deeply respect, particularly considering the size of the institution that he's responsible for. And I think that he is a wonderful example of what happens when you give these directorial and high-ranking kind of curatorial positions to people who are not white and who have commitments to ways of being in the world and intellectual and cultural and social traditions outside of the kind of learned commitment to kind of Eurocentricity. Yeah.
I have also a question. So when I was studying theology, we had a professor who was complaining that Leibniz was not a communist. Leibniz was saying that the world was perfect, and he didn't had sufficient attention for the fact that there was people who were suffering. All the kind of intellectuals we have from the end of the 19th, beginning 20th century make that distinction between civilized and primitive people. Durkheim, Freud, all the anthropologists of that day, they were all making that kind of distinction. So they were indeed complicit in that kind of idea. A famous example for us Belgians is the famous strip of Tintin in Africa, Hergé's Kuifje in Afrika. It's really a problematic thing. And now, of course, Tintin has lost his innocence. Now we know. But there is a difference, of course, from the perspective we have now than the perspective my parents had and their parents had. And my question is about how blameworthy is there a kind of moral awareness that is universal and that is there for every time in the same way, or is it evolving? And if it is evolving, is there space for some mercy for the past, for some indeed very problematic views? So I wanted to have your opinion about that, because indeed, when we are confronted with that kind of critique, we feel participated. We are Belgians. We have indeed our African Museum, which is, it was originally a statement of that kind of bad way of dealing with issues. But to live with that kind of past, it would be interesting for us to know how you would indeed, how blameworthy is Hergé, how blameworthy are all these original missionaries who came to the Congo, also with the intention to save people. Now it's crazy to think so, but they have not all done that in bad faith. I would suppose.
I think you're not going to like my answer,
Okay.
as I think you might suspect. Because I think I want to start with the fact that, people often say, my parents' generation, da da da. There were campaigns at the time for abolition, right? At every moment, there are people who oppose the colonial mission. There are people who, regardless of how they communicated it to publics, had an understanding or some minimal understanding, and regardless of whether they knew the capaciousness of the brutality of Leopold's kind of rubber plantation, right? They had some sense that this is not okay. So I think this is my kind of starting point, that in every epoch, in every kind of moment of gradually increasing awareness or kind of paradigmatic shift of ideas of the time, there are always people who are pretty steadfast in their opposition to colonial violence. The second thing is that I tend to not be that interested in the moral question. I tend to not be that interested in the question of evil. Hitler was a vegetarian. I'm sure Rhodes said Ian Smith said very nice things about the Ndebele people during the Gukurahundi, the genocide in Zimbabwe. There are people who do and participate in horrific acts and then go home and are wonderful spouses to their partners, and they're wonderful parents to their children, and love nature and love sport and all of these things, right? So the moral question is not interesting to me because of the way that we are able to hold these kind of contradictions in our heads at the same time. We are able to be good people by all senses of the word in our actions, and to justify our participation in and benefit from violent dispossession. And we are able to, through whatever gymnastics make the most sense, distance ourselves from the violences that structure our material worlds. So regardless of whether you agreed or not, you are still beneficiaries, materially beneficiaries. The lives and welfare systems that Europeans get to enjoy are constructed from the wealth accrued from the plunder of non-white people around the world. And I think that for me is a question that is much, much more interesting than reassuring, the kind of reassurances that we are often asked to give as non-white people with folks who are sitting in the discomfort. And I actually invite you to just sit in the discomfort, because I think sitting in the discomfort and this confrontation in the ways that your parents and grandparents and so on were complicit is like a sign of some kind of ethical something, right? It's the lack of discomfort, I think, is much more worrisome, because there's nothing that is butting against a kind of sensibility that you have as far as a sense of empathy or care for or whatever for other people in the world. And so I really invite you to just sit in being uncomfortable and what it means to encounter or bump up against a worldview that altogether transforms and upends what you have learned as a Belgian, what you have learned as a white person, what you have learned as a person of a certain age, where certain ways of consuming the colonial encounter was completely normal. Because it is not my responsibility to help you, I don't want to say not my responsibility to help you, that's not what I mean, but it is not for me to adjudicate a kind of like moral responsibility. And I think it's much more so about like the materiality, the kind of political ethic of like race and how all of these racist things are embedded in the structures and institutions in which you navigate, and what you do when you are confronted by these remaining or maintained or whatever edifices of colonialism and racism, and how you proceed from there. I think this is for me what my interest is.
Your answer is a little bit confusing, because On the one side, you say it's not about morality,
Sure.
but at the end of the day, it seems to be a kind of moral guilt.
Well, I think it's less of, so this is what I mean. I'm not interested in guilt. I don't care about guilt. What guilt allows is a kind of a kind of temporary self-flagellation that doesn't necessarily compel a sense of action. If anything, if there's any kind of moral response, I want you to feel shame. I want you to feel a shame that is so profound that it boils your blood and moves you to do something beyond this sense of how do I grapple with the sins of my father? How do you grapple with your sins right now, today?
I agree that I need to feel ashamed.
Yeah.
Because we know nowadays.
Yeah, but so this
But
is
I
what
can
I'm
also
saying.
understand why people didn't feel so ashamed when the time was not
They didn't
yet
feel so
ready.
ashamed because black people weren't people. And it was acceptable to say out loud that black people are not people. That's why. Yeah, I think.
I would like to remind some of you know, in the 1930s, a Belgian missionary wrote a book. Tempels was his name. And he wrote a book, Bantu Philosophy. In Belgium, it was almost ignored, but it was rapidly translated in English. And got a lot of people reading it all over the world. This is an example of somebody who was raising the questions, because he was saying, he started his book with, if you don't live according to philosophy, your philosophy according to your living. So Bantu philosophy does exist, which in those days was daring, and it was a missionary who did this. But it didn't ring a bell with most people. So I think you're right when you say there were always people who were putting questions.
Thank you so much for that very powerful intervention, in particular in relation and juxtaposition to last evening. So I was thinking alongside you around the experience and the encounter with these museums and these institutions, and with these remains, the unburied, unconcluded journeys of embodied figures and people. And I thought to myself, if I'm in a museum and I'm seeing skulls or human bodies, I would interpret that as a threat, I think. And the threat is, and the refusal to return those bodies is, and therefore a refusal of apology and a refusal to act upon shame, is that I am this institution, or this state that funds this institution, is prepared to perhaps repeat that which does not now, they have not concluded a process of addressing why that body is in that museum. And so I found myself thinking, what to a Congolese, a Belgian citizen of Congolese descent say, is this trip to the Africa Museum, where they see bodies that are perhaps genetically closer to theirs than somebody, you know, the plunderer. They are the plundered, the plunderer. I'm not sure I would look at those bodies in mourning so much as it is what the dead body says to the living. And the dead body says to a living person, a young black Belgian, I don't know how it's used here. We refuse, actually, to behave like when you do something wrong, you apologize, you make amends. The refusal to make proper amends is also a holding pattern that says we may need to do it again. And that, I think, addresses this question of, you know, we've talked a lot in the last few days about prevention and genocide prevention and the role of education and museum education. And I found myself wondering as listening to you about the accidental lessons
or the unintentional lessons that a young person encounters in these institutions, depending upon their own subjectivity in relation to these collections. And do the curators know? I mean, you know what I mean? Like, I don't know if the curators know. I don't really care, actually. But I do think that this is the relation to the state that so many young people actually do encounter, that these institutions are threatening.
Yeah.
And the education is coercive. And that's also a part of that threat. You must see these things as we ask you to see them. Even when it's like a kind of posed as an opening or as loose. It is not loose because the installation is there and it's permanent. It's in a curio, right? Anyway, it's a reflection.
Yeah, no, I mean, I remember I went to the Quai Branly for the first time and I saw something that is tattooed on my body. And that for me was tremendously unsettling. I mean, it's a kind of shield from Southern Africa. It's a kind of Nguni, Zulu shield, whatever. Pretty ubiquitous. Like you can like buy them in South Africa pretty easily. But still, right? There's something about this. And I'm not even from a kind of French colony. Zimbabwean stuff often doesn't get into these spaces. But I think that's exactly how I would see it. I mean, fortunately, except for mummies, they have the decency to store bones elsewhere, and they tend not to put them on display. But I remember being in the kind of back archive of the American Museum of Natural History, and like walking past a cabinet that was kind of covered in butcher paper, and I was like, what's going on here? And she's like, that's where they have the long bones, rib cages, tibias, and so on. Walked a little bit further, and you see a very high ceiling, and you can kind of see windows at the top, and they're little boxes, and she's like, that's where the bones are kept, just stacked on top of each other. And it absolutely felt like a threat. Again, as somebody who comes from a culture of, I mean, ancestor veneration is kind of an annoying shorthand, but comes from a culture where burial is culturally foundational. Some of the medical museums do still have them. Yeah, like the Museum Vrolijk. But I think he's also doing an interesting job, but it's weird.
Just the last question, because we are already...
Sorry.
If I may, I hope not to explode the debate, but I'm sorry I came in a bit late for your primary presentations, but we've been engaging throughout the fortnight together. And I want to offer a short comment followed by a question which is of practical significance to my discipline. My discipline is international law. Precisely because I think that international lawyers and, frankly, any scholars have much to learn from one another. I think the interdisciplinary work that we've been doing here has been of immense value. For me specifically, history, historiography, the humanities help us to understand the systems, the structures, the institutions we have today, as well as their limitations, their biases, sometimes their impossibility for redemption. But there's a point I want to ask in relation to the exchange that Zoe and Bart have had here, and perhaps is also addressed to Dirk in some respects. And I'm going to pivot into climate change very briefly, but I'll try to explain why. Guilt and shame matter. Guilt and shame might be causes of action. I think we need to be confronted with the world that we live in and with as comprehensive an understanding of how we got here and why we got here. And I think that humanities scholarship really helps us to understand these things and to ask uncomfortable questions, specifically for those of us that work in disciplines that self-style themselves as enlightenment-based, as rationally based. Law is quintessentially one of those. And then what? And I'm not asking in the sense that scholarship doesn't matter if it's not a call to action or if it doesn't lead to concrete deliverables. I'm not a government bureaucrat. But at the same time, we in my own discipline struggle existentially with what we can do with this knowledge, how we can make good on this knowledge, how we can call it to action. And the reason I'm going to pivot to climate change now is because in the area of genocide research and mass atrocities research, we are talking about very human forms of behavior towards one another. And in the end, we do start asking questions about guilt and responsibility and reparation. In climate change, we are talking about something very, very different because we're talking about the ordinary, the emissions caused by generations and generations of industrial production. And there, the debate turns on the crisis of today. And I'm perfectly willing to go with the argument that genocide, slavery, colonialism, racism, empire have created enduring social structures and continuing structures of oppression. I agree with that. Climate change is slightly different because we have a continuing crisis. Look around you. I mean, come on, this is Belgium. It's not even June. And there the debate lies differently because there is a debate about resolving the problem without apportioning responsibility, without asking questions of who. Sometimes that debate revolves around who has the most capability, ought to do the most. So the Norway or the Switzerland sort of call. And at the same time, and that's how I thread this back to the mass atrocities question, to the genocide question, where I still think there's something qualitatively different. I was at a conference recently in sub-Saharan Africa where I was trying to argue for a no liability capabilities approach to the climate emergency. Those who have, fix. And the response from everyone in the audience from sub-Saharan Africa was, no, there's a justice claim.
Not our problem.
Exactly, and I find that no, they did not. No, they accept the problem. I was in Kenya, a country.
No, but I mean, in terms of like, this is not our responsibility as far as the people responsible for causing.
Actually, no. The argument is richer than that. It's more interesting. I go with it. Yeah, they are saying the West should pay more. That's a different argument.
Yeah.
But what they're saying, which I found so fascinating, and I want to bring it back to this because it is about action. What they were saying is, even if a capabilities approach to the climate emergency might be more effective in stopping it and saving our people from death and starvation and overheating, it doesn't reflect our theory of justice. We want a reparatory approach that recognizes the wrongs that have been done as early as the English Industrial Revolution and forgetting colonization, although that is another question, you know, but they wanted a reparatory approach, a recognition approach to something that is rather less polarizing, I think, than genocide and mass atrocities. I found that extremely interesting, but I want to circle back and just ask you, because in that sense, my disciplinary responsibility in some respects is, well, what do we do with this? Because law is an applied discipline. What do we do with this? I agree completely with the value of excavating and mapping and materializing the world that we live in. And I want to do something about it. And I don't know how. And my discipline does not know either. So I'm just throwing it out there because I suspect others from other vantage points have similar questions. But I just wondered what the two of you might have to say on this.
What I have to say is there exists Pan-African jurisprudence. And there exists understandings of justice that actually do offer plans. With regards to, for example, restitution, there are plans with budgets that are given to museums, and the museums are like, we'll think about it. You need to build up your capacity. Like they will just figure out and mobilize any reason to not have to do it. So there are actually, in this kind of justice-minded understanding of, yes, climate change also requires this like reparative machine that then recognizes what's going to happen when the climate refugees are overwhelmingly going to be from the global south, what this means for border regimes that are tired of having to take in and so on. These modes of plan making exist and have actually existed for a very long time. I think like Pinashe Chigumadzi, for example, is a historian of Southern Africa, and she is tremendous in the way that she thinks about, for example, intertemporality as instantiating statute of limitations that prevent action altogether. So I think it's a matter of the political will of the powerful countries to recognize and to legitimate these ways of understanding and these ways of trying to make repair at the same time that you're addressing this like prescient immediate problem, and perhaps considering that like all of their strategies have not been effective, or also just considering that they're fine with African people dying, and figuring out like, given that reality, how to force pressure accordingly.
Okay, I'm afraid that I need to close the session. You're already 20 minutes over time. It's exceptional, and it will keep an exception. Thank you very much for your beautiful introductions.